The main claim of critics is that Congress has to approve all uses of force by the president because of the declare war clause. And my first argument is based on practice. That's never been the way presidents and Congresses have acted.
And it's always an honor, a distinct honor, on the Michael Medved Show to welcome to the show John Yoo, who is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley Law School. He is also a distinguished visiting scholar at the School of Civic Leadership and the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. And he is a non-resident senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute. His extremely timely and very well-argued piece appeared today in National Review under the headline, "You, the Trump administration's actions in Venezuela are constitutional." The key element of the argument that you make, which goes back and looks at other decisions that were made by prior U.S. presidents that seemed to work out for the country. What is the core of the constitutionality argument for this action, military action in Venezuela?
Michael, great to be with you. Happy 2026. I think
Let's hope.
the main claim of critics is that Congress has to approve all uses of force by the president because of the declare war clause. And my first argument is based on practice. That's never been the way presidents and Congresses have acted. You can start with Thomas Jefferson with the Barbary pirates back in the 1800s, where Congress didn't give him any permission, but he sent a small fleet out to the Mediterranean and tried to overthrow these princes who were taking Americans hostage off of American ships. But you could carry it forward to the closest parallel to what happened over the weekend, which is in 1989, President George H.W. Bush sent in the military to overthrow the regime of Manuel Noriega and brought him back for trial. And Noriega was convicted in court and spent the rest of his life in jail. But I think people who criticize President Trump should at least be consistent about this. So if people think President Trump's attack on Venezuela was unconstitutional, did they raise the same objections when President Obama used force to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya, or President Clinton used force to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic and end the invasion of Kosovo by the Serbians, or the Korean War? We could go on and talk about presidents who have, as commander-in-chief, used the armed forces of a kind that Congress bought and paid for to try to protect the nation's security.
And so basically, you're saying it's constitutional. The question that I think is on everybody's minds right now is, constitutional or not, what's next? The president says we're going to be running Venezuela for a while. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, says not so fast. We won't really be running the country. Which is it? Where are we?
Well, I think, Michael, this is a question. There's a question of law and a question of policy. And I have to say, I worked on very similar issues in 2003 when I was in the Bush administration about what we were going to do after the invasion of Iraq. And we won so successfully that we had to immediately start thinking about how to reconstruct the country. Legally, if we're at war with Venezuela and then the new government invites us in and consents to us participating in the rebuilding of Venezuela, there's no legal issue. And that's essentially what happened in Iraq. Or even if the United States were to actually in some way become the occupying power in Venezuela after we've successfully won a war, we're still allowed to use oil revenues, for example, and use it to rebuild the country. I don't think the legality is going to, although I do think Congress will have to be involved at this point because it involves new appropriations. It involves hiring more people and sending them down to Venezuela to help rebuild. But I don't think that's the hard question. I agree with you, Michael. The harder question is political, because in order for us to be able to rebuild, we need to create a stable political situation. Companies and Americans aren't going to want to go to Venezuela unless they know the environment's secure, unless they can invest money securely, unless they know that their rights are going to be respected. And that's going to really involve creating a political system that's going to be stable and reliable. And I think ultimately that's going to be democratic.
Well, you talk about an alternate political system. One of the things that President Trump has drawn strong criticism about concerning his statement after the very successful extraction of Maduro and Maduro's wife is the fact that he dismissed the possibility of working with the Venezuelan opposition, including his competitor for the Nobel Peace Prize, Machado.
Yeah.
He said that she doesn't have the kind of popular support that would make her a viable alternative to Maduro. So instead, right now, they're working with Delcy
Kelsey.
Rodriguez, who's the vice president, who says she's just an interim president, that Maduro is still the real president. What's the right play for our president?
I mean, that's a tough question. I actually think that the United States will have to bring in Machado. I think he'll have to bring in Gonzalez, who was the official opposition candidate in the election. I believe he's sitting in exile in Spain right now. Those were the people who were democratically elected in elections just a few months ago. I think that what President Trump's probably doing is, and I think Secretary Rubio are saying they're willing to work with the existing people in power in Venezuela as part of a transition, I hope, to a more democratically elected government. But I also think it would be very hard for the United States to work with, on a permanent basis, the same security, the same military elites and the regimes that have been in power under Chavez and Maduro, because you're just going to get, Maduro version 2.0 and nothing will have significantly changed. From our interests, we want Venezuela not just to stop running drugs, but to stop being a hub for all of our opponents like Russia, Iran, and China that want to establish a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And I think for that, you need to have a more democratically responsible government in place.
The New York Times, they write in their editorial this morning that if there is an overriding lesson of American foreign affairs in the past century, it is that attempting to oust even the most deplorable regime can make matters worse. The United States spent 20 years failing to create a stable government in Afghanistan and replaced a dictatorship in Libya with a fractured state. The tragic consequences of the 2003 war in Iraq continue to beset America and the Middle East. To prevent a repetition of that kind of frustration, that kind of setback for our country, what should President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio and the Department of Defense under Pete Hegseth, what should they keep in mind to avoid those setbacks?
Okay, so just to remind you, I did work at the beginning of the occupation of Iraq after victory, but I left in the end of the summer of 2003, so I wasn't really there to see it through. But some of the things that I think we've learned from Iraq and Afghanistan, and let me add, by the way, I think Iraq in the end turned out to be a success, although at great cost. I mean, Iraq is today a parliamentary democracy, and I think it's Afghanistan that was really the failure. I think one thing they should keep in mind is that Venezuela is a very different place than the Middle East. Venezuela, until Chavez showed up, had had several decades of a well-functioning democracy. It was one of the richest countries in the world before Chavez and Maduro, I think, looted the country, and Cuba made its influence, spread its influence to the Venezuelan military and intelligence services. So I think you already had institutions and knowledge of democracy and free markets there that you didn't have in the Middle East. I also don't think that this is something that's going to be achieved, as we tried in Iraq and Afghanistan, by the American military trying to impose a kind of order with troops in Venezuela. That's maybe and here maybe the New York Times is getting at that. That I don't think it's true that the United States has often or always failed in replacing dictatorships with democracies. In fact, I think we've had a lot of successes. You could look at Japan and Germany after World War II, South
But what a
Korea,
cost.
Taiwan, the Philippines. Yes, at great cost. In some of these places at great cost. Some of these places not at such great cost if you've got a cooperative and willing population. And I think that's the key, is that I think that's why President Trump might have misspoken, or he's going to change his views. I think he really does have to work with the Democratic opposition in Venezuela, which really represents, as according to the poll results, a huge majority of the Venezuelan people want to return back to democracy. So it's not that the United States is going to be imposing an alien foreign system on the people of Venezuela. And so I think it's not going to require massive troop occupation or presence. And if it did, I don't think the the Trump administration would be interested in that anyway.
What about this idea that there are other countries that should be worried? In particular, Denmark, which wants to maintain its hold on Greenland.
You can never take your eyes off those tricky Danes.
Well, it is Canada, where President
too.
Trump has spoken again and again.
Yeah. They tried to steal the World Series from us.
Yeah, but it didn't work. Didn't work.
Yeah, didn't work. They failed.
Yes, but Mexico, for goodness sake, we had a successful war against Mexico before in the 1840s. And what about the Russian Federation itself? In other words, if you are taking the principle that it is legitimate to look at countries that are dysfunctional and disruptive to world peace, could you use, if this is a success in Venezuela, the same kind of logic to justify other adventures like this?
Well, I think this is one area, where whatever is the MAGA foreign policy and then traditional American strategy actually converge. I wasn't a great fan of the Trump national security strategy that was issued
right
a few weeks ago. Yeah, but the one thing, remember we talked about it, that there is a lot of agreement on, is that the United States has to put more teeth to the Monroe Doctrine, in the sense of preventing outside countries like Iran and China and Russia acting through Cuba or acting directly to try to undermine democracy, undermine free markets in our own hemisphere.
That several times in the last 48 hours, President Trump has described it as the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, and the other thing, I've been on some TV shows over the weekend where I saw Democrats disavowing the Monroe Doctrine. Wow. And I was like, this would come as great news to Jefferson and Monroe, some of the founders of your
party.
John Quincy
Adams, who actually wrote the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes, as Secretary of State, exactly. I mean, this was one of the great achievements of early democratic foreign policy in the United States, was to try to prevent the European empires from returning to the Western Hemisphere. And so I think that if you look at it with that lens, and I'm not claiming President Trump is thinking about this in this way, but I think that one way to explain what's happened here is that this is like the Monroe Doctrine, getting rid of the outside influences have basically frustrated the democratic will of the Venezuelan people. And then are there other countries in South America that could be similarly described? And you would have to say Colombia would be a country where they might have a lot of words. And I actually saw on TV this morning, Colombia's already starting to station troops and defensive posture.
President Petro said, "Come and get me," to President Trump. Speaking of come and get me, Rand Paul, senator from Kentucky, is going to be introducing new legislation that would require congressional approval for any other decision like this. Is that a good idea?
I think it would be unconstitutional, because I don't think that Congress is allowed to pass laws that restrict what the Constitution gives to the president. If Rand Paul or any other senator wants to prevent presidents from doing this, then they don't have to fund SEAL Team 6. They don't have to fund the massive offensive firepower that the American military enjoys. The American military is the only military probably that could carry out that kind of operation. Congress doesn't have to fund it, but instead what they want to do is fund those capabilities, give them to the president, and then take no responsibility for how they're used until after, once Congress sees whether it was successful or not.
Well, he's very unlikely to get a majority to back him up, Senator Paul, on this. Meanwhile, we will keep track of all these developments regarding other nations, particularly Colombia, and we'll continue to follow the always enlightened and challenging and informative commentary of John Yoo. Again, you would be looking for a deal with a transition to democratic government.
Yes, I think, and also that would be in the best interests of the people who are in the existing regime if they want any hope of any kind of reconciliation or immunity in a new Venezuela.
Thank you so much, John Yoo. You can read his article most recently at the National Review. It's linked at our website at MichaelMedved.com.